The wind carried dust across the open plain, curling around a lone rider making his way down the trail toward a settlement tucked against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. His name was Elias Turner, a man who had spent more than 2 decades surviving in the wilderness, living by his traps, his rifle, and his stubborn will. The mountains had shaped him into a figure of quiet endurance, but now the hunger for solitude was giving way to something else, the longing for rest. He wanted roots, a place where the storms of life would not chase him endlessly from one valley to another. Before we step deeper into Elias's story, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the twists that lie ahead. The small settlement he approached wasn't much more than a cluster of log cabins, a blacksmith's forge, and a modest general store. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of a hammer striking iron echoed faintly in the air. A weathered sign read, "Dawson's Crossing," the kind of place where folks knew one another's business and weighed outsiders with cautious eyes. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots pressing into the dirt street. His horse, a sturdy bay mare that had carried him faithfully through countless mountain passes, snorted as if sensing the end of their journey. He stroked her neck, speaking in a low voice. "You've done your part, girl. More than your part." His eyes lingered on her, with something like sorrow. At the edge of town, an old trapper named Harlan, whom Elias had known from trading posts years back, stood waiting. Harlan leaned on a walking stick, his frame bent, but his eyes still sharp. "Didn't reckon I'd see you down here, Turner. Thought you were married to them mountains." "Marriages end," Elias said with a dry half-smile. "Man gets tired of sleeping under snowdrifts." Harlan chuckled, then motioned to a cabin that sat apart from the others, close to the tree line. Its roof sagged slightly, and the chimney leaned like a weary soldier. That old place belonged to Silas Reed before he vanished. "Folks around here don't touch it. Too many whispers." Elias studied it carefully. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, a stake in the world. "I'll take it." Harlan raised his brows. "Take it? What do you mean?" "I'll trade." Elias patted the neck of his mare. "Horse for cabin." The words surprised even him, but once spoken they felt right. His horse had been freedom, but freedom no longer fed him. A cabin meant permanence. Harlan hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Deal's fair if you're set on it, but mind what I tell you, that cellar door in there's locked for a reason. Leave it be." Elias's eyes narrowed. "What's in it?" "Nothing you want to tangle with," Harlan muttered. He spat into the dirt, avoiding Elias's gaze. "Sheriff Holden'll tell you the same." Later, when the sheriff arrived to put formality on the exchange, Elias caught the way the man's eyes lingered on the cabin. Sheriff Holden was tall, broad-shouldered, his badge dulled by years in the sun. He didn't waste words. "If you're taking Reed's place, know this, that cellar stays shut. Don't go fooling with it." Elias met his gaze steadily. "Seems an odd warning to give a man about his own home." Holden's voice lowered, heavy as iron. "Some doors ain't meant to be opened." That night, after the trade was sealed and Elias watched his mare led away by Harlan, he stood before the cabin's weathered frame. The wind pressed through the trees, rattling the eaves, carrying the scent of pine and old smoke. Beneath his boots, the earth seemed to hum faintly, as though secrets lay buried just under the floorboards. Inside, the cabin greeted him with shadows and silence. His eyes settled on the trapdoor in the corner, its iron lock glinting in the dim light of his lantern. Sheriff Holden's warning echoed in his mind, but Elias was not a man easily swayed by another's fear. He placed his hand on the wood, feeling the cool grain beneath his calloused palm. Whatever lay hidden in that cellar, it now belonged to him. The morning sun stretched across Dawson's Crossing, spilling light over Elias Turner's new home. The cabin looked less foreboding by daylight, though its timbers still groaned under years of wear. He rose early, as mountain men always did, and set about making the place his own. The chimney spat smoke when he finally coaxed the hearth to life, and the scent of burning pine filled the single room. Dust motes swirled in the beams of sunlight, cutting through cracks in the shutters. Elias moved with the quiet efficiency of a man used to surviving alone. He stacked the sparse tools left behind, A rusted saw, a broken-handled axe, a few dented pots. They were little more than relics, yet he treated them with care. His every step across the creaking floorboards brought him closer to the cellar door in the corner. Its iron lock sat black and heavy, catching the light like an unblinking eye. He knelt, running a hand across the frame. The wood bore faint scratches, as if someone had once tried to pry their way in or out. Elias leaned back on his heels, unsettled but not afraid. He'd known harsher things in the wilderness than a locked door. Still, he couldn't ignore the way silence seemed to deepen when he lingered near it. The sound of footsteps outside drew him away. Opening the door, he found a woman approaching with a wicker basket. She was tall and lean, her dark hair tied in a simple knot. A plain dress and a shawl gave her an air of practicality. She greeted him with a polite nod. "You must be the new owner," she said. "I'm Martha Kane. I teach the children here in town." "Elias Turner," he replied, voice low but steady. She lifted the basket slightly. "I thought you might use some bread. Starting out in a place like this can be harder than folks expect." Elias accepted the basket with a nod of thanks. "Much obliged. Haven't had bread in weeks." Her eyes flicked toward the cabin with a trace of hesitation. "That place has seen its share of shadows. You'll hear talk, I'm sure." "Pay no mind to gossip, but—" Her words trailed off, as though she weighed whether to speak further. "I've heard enough warnings already," Elias said evenly. "What matters is, it's mine now." Martha gave a faint smile, half sympathy and half curiosity. "Then I hope it brings you peace, Mr. Turner?" She turned back toward town, leaving him with the warmth of fresh bread and a gnawing sense that even kindness carried caution here. Later that afternoon, as Elias split wood with the dull axe, another figure approached. Jed Collins, a broad-shouldered rancher with a weather-beaten face, leaned against the fence post. His hat shadowed his sharp eyes. "Traded your horse for this shack?" Jed asked, disbelief thick in his tone. "That's right." Jed gave a slow whistle. "Horse like that's worth more than 2 of these cabins. You must have lost your sense in them mountains." "Maybe I have," Elias said, driving the axe into the stump. "But I aim to stay." Jed shrugged. "Your business. Just don't stir up what's better left buried." With that, he tipped his hat and walked away, his words hanging in the cool mountain air like smoke. That evening, Elias sat before the fire, tearing pieces from Martha's bread. The cabin settled around him with its groans and sighs, as though the logs themselves breathed. His gaze returned again and again to the cellar door. The lock glinted faintly in the firelight, unmoving, unyielding. Sheriff Holden's warning rang in his ears, joined now by the veiled cautions of Martha and Jed. He told himself he didn't care, that a man owned what he lived in. Yet beneath his calm exterior, a spark of curiosity began to burn. The cabin had given him shelter, but it also carried secrets. And Elias Turner was not a man who walked away from secrets. Elias Turner soon discovered that settling into a cabin required a different kind of grit than roaming the mountains. Out in the wild, a man could follow the seasons, hunt where the game was thick, and move on when supplies ran low. But here, bound to 4 walls and a roof, he had to reckon with the demands of survival in one fixed place. The first challenge came quickly. Without a horse, hauling firewood from the nearby stand of pines was backbreaking work. He tied a crude sled from branches and dragged logs across the snow, his shoulders burning, his breath clouding in the icy air. Each load took hours, and the cold gnawed at his bones. By nightfall, his hands were raw, and the small pile of wood seemed pitiful compared to what winter would demand. Supplies dwindled too. He had traded most of his furs for tools, salt, and flour, but the general store offered little on credit to a newcomer. Elias rationed carefully, eating plain meals and stretching flour into thin cakes that barely filled his stomach. Hunger became a quiet companion. The weather turned against him one evening, as a snowstorm rolled in sudden and fierce. The wind howled through Dawson's Crossing, piling drifts against doors and windows. Elias sealed cracks with old cloth and sat by the fire, wrapped in his blanket, listening to the fury outside. The cabin shook under the storm's weight, but it held. Yet it was not only the wind that disturbed him. As the night wore on, he heard faint creaks from beneath the floorboards, as if timbers shifted in rhythm with the storm. He rose once, lantern in hand, and stood staring at the cellar door. The lock shone dull in the flickering light, and he could have sworn it trembled just slightly under some unseen strain. He waited, holding his breath, but no sound followed. Finally, he set the lantern aside and forced himself back to his chair. Still, unease wrapped tighter than the blanket around his shoulders. Morning brought clearer skies and bitter cold. The storm had buried his sled, and the woodpile was nearly gone. Elias cursed under his breath but set to digging. Halfway through his labor, a familiar voice called to him. "You'll freeze out here if you keep at that pace," Martha Kane said, standing at the path's edge, her shawl dusted with snow. Elias wiped frost from his beard. "No sense waiting for spring to save me." She stepped closer, carrying a small bundle. "I thought you might need this." She handed him a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, its warmth seeping into his cold hands. He looked at her with surprise, though he tried not to show it. "You've got a generous heart, Mrs. Kane." "It's Miss," she corrected softly. "And it's not generosity, it's sense. Hungry men make desperate choices, and I'd rather see you well fed than pushed to that point." Elias gave a grunt that could have been agreement or gratitude. He unwrapped the bread and took a bite, the crust crisp and the inside soft. The simple taste struck him harder than he expected, bringing back memories of family meals long gone. "You'll get through this," Martha said, watching him with steady eyes. "But Dawson's Crossing has its tests. Not everyone wants to see strangers succeed here." He met her gaze, noting the weight in her words. "I've faced worse than cold shoulders." That night, as he lay in bed, Elias thought of her kindness. It was the first warmth he had felt since arriving, but the storm had left its mark. Again, the cellar creaked faintly, and this time he was certain he heard something shift below. He told himself it was wood settling, nothing more. Yet his mind refused to rest, circling back to the locked door. The wilderness had taught him that every sound meant something, and this sound would not let him be. Elias Turner worked steadily to strengthen the cabin, for the storm had reminded him how fragile its walls were against nature's fury. He patched the roof with pine shingles scavenged from fallen barns, sealed the cracks between logs with mud and straw, and chopped wood until his shoulders ached. Each improvement made the cabin sturdier, yet no amount of work could silence the nagging thought of what lay beneath. One afternoon, while reinforcing the floorboards, he paused at the cellar door. The scratches along the frame stood out in the daylight, thin, jagged lines etched deep into the wood. He knelt and traced them with his calloused fingers. They weren't the work of rodents or casual wear. These marks looked deliberate, carved in haste as though someone had once tried desperately to claw their way through. A chill slid down his spine despite the fire burning in the hearth. Children passing on the road broke his thoughts. Their voices carried clearly in the crisp air. "Don't get too close to that place," one boy warned another. "That's where Silas Reed disappeared." "Ma says the cellar's cursed," a girl added. "If you open it, you'll vanish too." The children laughed nervously, shoving each other as they moved on, but Elias caught the edge of fear in their tones. He closed the door firmly and leaned his weight against it, as though daring whatever secrets lay beneath to rise up. Later that evening, while at the general store trading pelts for salt, Elias found himself in the company of Jed Collins again. The rancher leaned against the counter, his rough hands drumming idly while the storekeeper fetched supplies. "You still in that cabin?" Jed asked, his tone low but pointed. "I am." Jed studied him a moment, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "Then take some advice. Don't dig too deep into what came before you. Men vanish from this land when they start asking the wrong questions." Elias narrowed his eyes. "What questions would those be?" "The kind you're already thinking about," Jed replied, adjusting his hat. He didn't wait for an answer, only took his sack of grain and left. The words lingered, heavier than the snow clouds gathering overhead. Elias was no stranger to superstition. He had heard tales from trappers about haunted canyons and cursed trails. But this felt different. The warnings carried not only fear, but also guilt, as though the townsfolk themselves bore responsibility for what lay hidden. That night, unable to sleep, Elias sat at the table sharpening his knife. The steady rasp of steel on stone filled the cabin, steadying his nerves. Yet every so often he glanced toward the cellar. The fire cast shadows across the floor, and in their shifting light the door appeared almost alive, breathing, waiting. The knock at his door startled him. He opened it to find Sheriff Holden standing there, lantern in hand. Snowflakes clung to the sheriff's coat and his jaw was tight. "You've been asking around," Holden said without preamble. "I've done nothing but live in the house I traded for," Elias replied, his voice calm, though his hand still held the knife. Holden stepped inside without invitation, setting his lantern on the table. The flame flickered across his stern face. "Let me be plain, Turner. That cellar ain't for you to touch. Reed built that place, and what he left behind don't concern you." "It concerns me if it's under my floor," Elias said evenly. The sheriff's eyes hardened. "You're a mountain man. You ought to understand that sometimes survival means leaving things buried. Don't make yourself a problem in this town." With that, Holden took his lantern and left, the door slamming against the wind. Elias stood in silence, the sheriff's warning burning hotter than the fire in the hearth. The scratches on the cellar frame haunted him. They were not the marks of time, but of desperation. And now more than ever, Elias knew that the truth of the cabin's past was clawing its way toward him. Elias Turner rose before dawn, the chill of the mountain air biting through the thin walls of the cabin. He stoked the fire and set a kettle of water to boil, but his mind was not on the day's chores. It was fixed on Sheriff Holden's visit the night before, the sheriff's words still clanging in his thoughts like a hammer against an anvil. He stepped outside, breath steaming in the dim light, and split wood until his muscles ached. Each swing of the axe seemed to carry the weight of Holden's warning. "Don't make yourself a problem in this town." But Elias had lived too long by his own rules to bend easily. When the sun climbed higher, he saddled no horse, he had none, but walked into Dawson's Crossing with steady strides. The streets were busy with wagons and voices, the smell of leather and smoke thick in the air. He stopped at the smithy, greeted the blacksmith with a nod, and went about trading furs for nails and powder. Yet all the while, he felt eyes on him, the sheriff's eyes. Sure enough, Holden appeared near the general store, his wide frame blocking the doorway. The two men locked gazes across the dusty street. Elias finished his business, then crossed toward him. "Morning, Sheriff," Elias said evenly. Holden folded his arms. "Morning. I hear you've been asking questions about Reed's place." "I ask what any man would," Elias replied. "I bought that cabin fair. What lies under it concerns me more than it does you." Holden's jaw tightened. "You listen here, Turner. Some history don't need digging. Silas Reed was no saint, and what he left behind could do more harm than good. Folks here are trying to live decent lives. You stir up old trouble, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of this town." Elias's eyes narrowed. "I've never been one to scare easy. I've lived through winters that swallowed men whole. I've faced rivers that could crush a body against rocks. If you think your warnings will turn me aside, you misjudge me." A tense silence hung between them, broken only by the rattle of a wagon passing. Holden stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "You don't know what was buried with that cellar. Leave it, Turner, or you'll answer for it." Elias didn't flinch. "A man has a right to know what sits beneath his own roof. If you're so afraid of it, maybe it's you who has something to hide." The sheriff's eyes flashed, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned sharply and strode away, his boots grinding into the dirt. Elias stood still, watching him go, his mind turning over the exchange. The sheriff's warnings weren't born of superstition. They carried the sharp edge of guilt, maybe even fear. Elias had seen fear in men before, in trappers cornered by wolves, in ranch hands when storms swept the plains. Holden carried the same weight, though buried under authority. That evening, back at the cabin, Elias sat by the fire with Martha Kane's bread on the table. He replayed the conversation with Holden, considering the sheriff's every word. For the first time since trading his horse, he wondered if he had bought more than a roof and walls. He might have inherited a shadow that stretched deeper than the cellar itself. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the faint howl of coyotes across the ridge. Elias leaned back in his chair, staring at the locked trapdoor. His instincts, honed by years in the wild, told him that Holden wasn't just protecting the town. He was protecting himself. Elias clenched his jaw. Whatever secret the sheriff feared so greatly, it was now Elias's burden, and he was not the kind of man to walk away from a burden once it settled on his shoulders. Winter clamped down hard on Dawson's Crossing, and Elias Turner felt the weight of every frozen day. His traps, once dependable, came up empty again and again. Snow muffled the land, burying trails and choking streams until the wilderness seemed as silent and barren as stone. Hunger gnawed at him worse than wolves ever had. He stretched flour into a thin gruel, boiled pine needles for a bitter tea, and chewed strips of dried venison until his jaw ached. Still, it was never enough. He rose before sunrise, bundled against the cold, and hiked miles into the timber to set lines. Hours later he returned with nothing but frost clinging to his beard. Standing in his cabin, staring at the empty table, Elias felt a sharp ache that was more than hunger. It was helplessness, a sensation foreign to him. In the mountains, he had always moved on when game ran thin. But here, tied to this cabin, he had no escape. One evening, as he struggled to light damp wood in the hearth, a knock sounded at his door. Martha Kane stepped in, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The warmth of her presence contrasted sharply with the chill inside. "You're thinner than you were last week," she said, her eyes sweeping across the cabin. "How long have you been living on scraps?" Elias gave a short shrug. "Long enough." She set the bundle on the table and unwrapped it, revealing bread and a small wedge of cheese. The smell alone nearly undid him. "I can't take charity," Elias said, though his eyes lingered on the food. "It isn't charity," she replied firmly. "It's survival. Folks out here last only if they look out for one another. Don't be so stubborn you starve yourself for pride." Elias hesitated, then tore off a piece of bread. The taste filled his mouth with a warmth that spread through his chest. For the first time in days, the knot of hunger loosened. "Thank you," he said quietly. Martha's expression softened. "You're welcome. My husband used to say a man can wrestle bears and storms, but it's the hunger that breaks him first. Don't let it." Elias studied her, seeing in her eyes the shadow of loss she rarely spoke of. He wanted to ask more, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he nodded. After she left, the cabin felt less lonely, though her presence had stirred something he wasn't sure he welcomed, the sense that he was no longer entirely alone. Days later, while cutting kindling, Elias overheard two men talking near the store. They spoke of Silas Reed, the cabin's former owner. "Reed ran with smugglers, I heard," one muttered. "Smugglers, some say worse. My pa told me Reed hid things folks weren't meant to see. Sheriff knew, but he let it be, long as Reed vanished quiet." Elias stood frozen, pretending to stack his wood while their words sank in. So the cellar wasn't just a place of whispers. It was tied to Reed's disappearance, and perhaps to the sheriff's silence. That night he sat by the fire, staring at the trapdoor. Hunger twisted in his belly, but another hunger stirred too, the hunger for answers. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What did you leave behind, Reed?" he muttered aloud. The crackle of the fire answered only with sparks. The storm outside deepened, snow piling against the walls. But Elias felt a storm inside him too. Martha's kindness had given him strength to endure the winter, yet the rumors gnawed at him as fiercely as hunger had. The locked cellar wasn't just wood and iron. It was a secret demanding to be unearthed. And Elias Turner was not a man who could turn his back on such demands. The storm had eased, leaving the land glazed in brittle frost. Elias Turner stepped outside at dawn, his boots crunching through the snow, and breathed in the thin, sharp air. For the first time in weeks, the traps he set caught little more than a half-starved rabbit. He skinned it quickly, but even as he worked, his eyes drifted toward the cabin, more precisely toward what lay beneath it. By evening, after choking down the meager stew he managed from the rabbit, Elias sat staring at the locked cellar door. He had resisted for weeks, obeying warnings that made little sense, but hunger and rumor had sharpened his determination. If Reed had indeed hidden goods below, they might still be there. Food, furs, maybe even coin. Pride no longer outweighed need. He fetched a set of old tools left in the cabin, a rusted chisel, a file, and a bent nail. He straightened against the table. Kneeling before the lock, he worked the metal into the keyhole. The iron resisted stubbornly, groaning as though it hadn't been touched in years. His breath fogged the air as he pressed harder, sweat dripping despite the chill. The lock clicked faintly, but refused to open. Frustrated, Elias wedged the chisel against the hinges, levering until wood splintered. The sound echoed through the quiet cabin like a gunshot. He froze, listening. For a long moment, silence held. Then came a sound, soft, hollow, an echoing thud from somewhere within the cellar. Elias's heart hammered. He pressed his ear to the door but heard nothing more. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling back. The cellar remained sealed, but his resolve deepened. Something was inside, and it had weight. He was still crouched there when a knock rapped sharply on the door behind him. Elias sprang to his feet, hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. He opened the door to find Sheriff Holden standing in the snow, lantern in one hand, revolver at his side. "What are you doing, Turner?" Holden's voice was cold as the wind. "Fixing what belongs to me," Elias replied evenly, though his chest still heaved from the effort. Holden's eyes flicked to the cellar, then back to Elias. His jaw clenched. "I told you once, I'll tell you again. That door stays shut." "And I told you," Elias countered. "It's my floor, my lock, my right to know what's under it." The sheriff stepped inside, lantern light spilling across the scratched doorframe. His presence filled the small cabin, the weight of authority pressing like a storm cloud. "You think you're owed answers? You're owed nothing but peace if you're smart enough to keep it. Reed's cellar ain't a treasure chest. It's a graveyard for trouble." Elias met his gaze without blinking. "I've lived too long listening to my own judgment, Sheriff. Don't expect me to bend because you frown at me." Holden's lips tightened, and for a moment Elias thought he might draw the revolver. Instead, the sheriff leaned close, his voice a low growl. "You keep testing me, Turner, and you'll regret it. This town don't need another fool stirring up ghosts best forgotten." With that, Holden turned sharply, stomping out into the snow. The door slammed, and the cabin rattled as though struck by the sheriff's anger itself. Elias stood motionless, his pulse still pounding. He looked back at the cellar door, the gouges in the wood now harsher under lantern light. Whatever was inside had made a sound, and Holden's fury only confirmed it. There was truth buried down there. He sat heavily in his chair, gripping his knife handle until his knuckles whitened. He didn't know how or when, but the lock would break. And when it did, the secrets of Silas Reed's cellar would belong to him alone. The following days brought a fragile calm, though the memory of Sheriff Holden's warning lingered in Elias Turner's mind like the aftertaste of bitter whiskey. He poured himself into work, cutting wood, hauling water, and repairing the sagging roof. But even in the rhythm of labor, he could not escape the weight of the locked cellar. It sat under his feet, an unspoken challenge that grew heavier with every passing hour. Yet life in Dawson's Crossing would not allow him to keep to himself. Word had spread that the mountain man had tangled with Holden, and folks began to measure him differently, some with suspicion, others with respect. One afternoon, Jed Collins rode up to Elias's place with 2 ranch hands. The men carried rifles, and the cattle lowing in the valley below told the story clear enough. Rustlers had been prowling. "Turner," Jed called, swinging down from his horse, "you're handy with a gun, or so they say. I could use another rifle tonight." Elias leaned on his axe handle. "Rustlers, then?" "3 head gone this week," Jed replied grimly. "They'll try again. I'd rather stand ready than count more losses." Elias weighed the offer. He was no rancher, yet something in Jed's tone rang honest, like a man defending what he bled to build. Finally, Elias nodded. "I'll come." That night, under a half-moon sky, they lay in wait along the fence line. Frost glistened on the grass, and the cattle shifted uneasily. Hours passed before shadows moved across the ridge. Rustlers, 3 men on horseback, crept toward the herd. At Jed's signal, Elias lifted his rifle. A single shot cracked the stillness, scattering the thieves before they could cut a single steer loose. The rustlers fired back wildly, but Elias's steady aim forced them to retreat into the dark. When silence returned, Jed clapped him on the shoulder. "You shoot straight, Turner. Maybe you ain't just a drifter after all." It wasn't friendship, not yet, but respect had begun to form between them, forged in the tension of that frozen night. Back in town the next morning, Martha Kane found Elias at the store. Her smile carried warmth that cut through the cold air. "Word travels fast," she said. "Seems you've earned yourself a measure of trust." Elias shrugged, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "Just did what needed doing." Martha studied him a moment. "You remind me of my husband. He had that same way of carrying burdens quiet, like they were his alone." Elias felt a pang he didn't expect. "What happened to him?" She hesitated, eyes drifting toward the snowy hills. "Violence. A gun in the wrong hands. It took him quick." Her voice was steady, but Elias caught the shadow behind it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Martha's eyes met his. "Don't be. Just be careful. This town has a way of swallowing good men." Her words lingered with him long after she left. He returned to his cabin, the bread she had given him still warm in his satchel. As he sat by the fire that evening, the cellar door loomed in his sightline once more. Every kindness he received, Jed's respect, Martha's trust, seemed to pull him deeper into the fabric of Dawson's Crossing. Yet that cellar remained a reminder that he was still an outsider, bound to secrets the town feared. It wasn't only about survival anymore. The locked door had become a question of belonging. Could he truly plant roots here while ignoring the shadow beneath his floor? The thought coiled in him, steady and relentless. He had proven his worth to others, but he knew he would never rest until he proved something to himself as well. And that meant facing whatever Silas Reed had left behind. Sleep became a stranger to Elias Turner. Each night, when the cabin settled and the fire shrank to embers, his mind returned to the cellar. He dreamed of muffled voices whispering through the floorboards, of hands clawing upward from the shadows. The dreams woke him drenched in sweat, his knife clutched in his palm before he even knew he had reached for it. By dawn he was weary, but the restless pull of the locked door only grew stronger. One bitter morning, while repairing the barn roof, Elias noticed something unusual. The beam above the hay rack, worn smooth from years of use, had a faint seam. Curiosity stirred. He pried at the wood with his knife and found a hollow tucked within the beam. Inside lay a small, tarnished key, wrapped in oilskin. He turned it over in his hand, the metal cold and heavy. A key left behind, hidden, forgotten, or deliberately concealed. His pulse quickened. Could this be the key to the cellar? That evening, Elias sat at the table with the lantern burning low. He set the key before him, staring at it as if it might move of its own accord. The iron glinted faintly, daring him. He rose and approached the cellar door, heart hammering. Sliding the key into the lock, he turned gently. The mechanism shifted with a dull scrape, but the door did not open. He withdrew the key, uncertain whether the lock was rusted beyond use, or whether this key belonged to something else entirely. His hand lingered on the cold wood when a heavy knock sounded at his door. He opened it to find Sheriff Holden standing in the snow once more, his face drawn tight, his eyes fierce. "You've been prying again," Holden said. Not a question, but an accusation. Elias crossed his arms. "Found a key. Figured it belongs to what's mine." Holden's jaw flexed. "That key ain't yours to use. If you value your life, you'll throw it in the river and forget it." Elias studied him, noting the tremor in the sheriff's voice, the sheen of sweat at his temple despite the cold. "Strange thing for a lawman to fear a locked door," Elias said quietly. Holden stepped closer, his voice low. "You don't understand what's buried there. You open that cellar, you open wounds this town can't afford. Some things are better left to rot in the dark." Elias held his gaze unyielding. "Then why warn me so hard, Sheriff, unless you've got reason to fear what comes out?" For a long moment, silence stretched between them, the wind whistling through the trees. Holden's eyes burned, but he said no more. Finally he turned sharply, boots crunching in the snow as he strode into the night. Elias shut the door, his breath ragged. He leaned against the wall, clutching the key in his fist. The sheriff's fear was no superstition. It was guilt, raw and deep. Elias could taste it in his words. He set the key on the table, staring at it until his vision blurred. The decision pressed down on him like the weight of the mountains. If he left the cellar shut, he might live out his days in uneasy peace. But if he opened it, he would confront truths the sheriff himself feared. By the fire's glow, Elias whispered to the empty room, "I will open it, one way or another." The cellar remained locked, but the choice had been made. For Elias Turner, there was no turning back. Elias woke to the first light of dawn, the cabin chilled by the night's frost. His breath hung heavy in the air as he sat up in the dark, the weight of his decision heavy on his chest. The key was still on the table, gleaming faintly in the dim light from the hearth. It felt like a weight he couldn't shake, pulling him toward the cellar, toward the answers he had long avoided. He dressed quickly, his movements stiff with the cold, and ate nothing but a slice of dry bread. The world outside was silent, blanketed under layers of snow, the trees standing still as sentinels. The land was frozen, yet inside him a fire burned, fierce and relentless. The time had come. Elias approached the trapdoor, his pulse quickening with every step. His hand hovered over the key as though it might move of its own accord. He had known the door would be opened eventually. There had never been any other option. Still, now that the moment had arrived, the weight of the act pressed down on him. With steady hands, he inserted the key into the lock. It turned easily, the soft click of the mechanism both reassuring and ominous. For a moment, Elias hesitated, his mind racing with everything that had brought him here, the warnings, the fear in the sheriff's eyes, the whispers of the town. He had defied them all, but now he would face the consequences. He opened the door. The air that rose from the cellar was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faint but unmistakable. Elias felt his stomach tighten as the darkness below seemed to swallow the light of the lantern. He bent down, steadying himself against the frame, and peered into the blackness. The steps were wooden and old, creaking under his weight as he descended. The cellar was smaller than he had expected. The floor was bare except for scattered crates, some broken, some intact. The air was thick, the silence almost suffocating. As Elias moved farther into the room, his boots kicked up dust that had settled over the years. His eyes scanned the area, lingering on the old crates, the shelves that lined the walls. It wasn't until he reached the far corner that he found it, hidden beneath a pile of old rotting blankets. A wooden chest, locked tight and reinforced with iron bands. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He had found it. This was the secret that had kept Dawson's Crossing so tight-lipped. He reached down and pried the chest open. The lid groaned in protest, but it gave way to reveal a collection of items that made Elias's pulse race. Inside were several bags of what appeared to be coins, old-worn but unmistakably gold. The chest also contained ledgers, their pages yellowed with age. He flipped through them, the entries filled with strange names, dates, and cryptic figures. As Elias examined the contents of the chest, the door to the cellar creaked above him. The sound was faint at first, but then it grew louder, a heavy footstep on the creaking floorboards. He looked up sharply, instinctively reaching for his rifle, but the cellar remained still. Nothing moved. A sharp knock at the door echoed from above, louder this time. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of what he had uncovered bearing down on him. The sheriff's warnings came flooding back, and he could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Who was standing above him, and what did they want? The truth was now in his hands, but the consequences of revealing it were yet to be seen. Elias knew, deep in his gut, that this was only the beginning. The knock at the door sent a cold shiver down Elias's spine. For a heartbeat he froze, the chest in front of him heavy with secrets that were now his to carry. He could still hear the sheriff's voice in his mind. Some things are better left to rot in the dark. And now, standing there in the quiet of the cellar, Elias realized that whatever lay in this room would change everything. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing against his chest. But then the knock came again, harder this time, demanding. Elias stood quickly, tucking the ledgers and the gold bags back into the chest with quick hands. He slammed the lid shut and locked it, hiding the key beneath the dust. His pulse raced, and for the first time in years he felt the familiar stirrings of fear creeping up from deep within. But it was not enough to stop him. He ascended the steps to the cabin, each one creaking under his weight, the darkness of the cellar still haunting the back of his mind. As he reached the top, he could make out the outline of the sheriff standing in the doorway. His broad shoulders were hunched against the cold, his stance imposing as always, but there was something different in his eyes, a cold, hard edge. "You opened it," Holden said, his voice as hard as the ground beneath them. Elias stood tall, his chest rising and falling with each breath. "I did." Holden's eyes flicked toward the cellar door, his jaw tightening. "And now you know, don't you?" Elias's gaze never wavered. "I know enough." The sheriff stepped inside, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "You've made a grave mistake, Turner. You don't know what you're dealing with. Those weren't just some old trinkets in that chest. They were tied to men, dangerous men who still walk this earth." Elias's hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, though he didn't draw it. "And what of it, Sheriff? You knew. You all knew what was down there, and you let it fester. You let Reed's secrets poison this town." Holden's lips thinned, and he stepped closer. The tension between them was palpable, thick as the cold winter air. "I did what I had to do. I kept this town safe. We couldn't afford to let the truth come out. If people knew what Reed had really been, they'd tear this place apart." Elias's voice was low but firm. "And you thought it was better to let men live in fear, to let them suffer under the weight of silence." The sheriff's face hardened further. "The truth isn't always something people can live with, Turner. It's not a luxury, not in this land, not for people like us." Elias shook his head slowly. "Maybe you're right, but I've lived with my own truth long enough, and I can't turn my back on this one. Not now, not when it's mine to fix." For a long moment neither man spoke. The crackling of the fire in the hearth was the only sound filling the room. Finally Holden broke the silence. "You're making a dangerous enemy, Elias." "I already have," Elias replied, his voice steady. "And I'm not afraid of it." Holden stared at him for a long while as if measuring the truth of his words. The sheriff's face remained unreadable, but for the briefest second there was something in his eyes, something like regret. "Then you'll face the consequences of your actions," Holden said finally, his voice grim. "And when they come for you, don't expect any help from me." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the cabin, leaving Elias standing in the silence that had suddenly become even heavier. Elias watched the door close behind the sheriff, his chest still tight. He had known that opening the cellar would stir trouble, but he had not expected this weight of responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He looked back toward the cellar, where the chest waited, its secrets sealed once again. He knew, deep in his gut, that this was only the beginning. The town would not let him live in peace for much longer. And Sheriff Holden's warning had only confirmed what Elias had feared all along. There were consequences to the truth, and he would face them, no matter the cost. Snow melted slowly that week, revealing muddy streets and the restless chatter of Dawson's Crossing. Elias Turner could feel the shift in the air the moment he set foot in town. Heads turned when he passed, voices lowered to whispers. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. The cellar was no longer a secret held close by a few. Somehow word had slipped free. At the general store, the owner greeted him with forced politeness, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. Outside, two women murmured, their gazes flicking in Elias's direction before quickly turning away. The town was beginning to fracture under the weight of half-known truths. It wasn't long before Jed Collins sought him out. The rancher rode up to the cabin in the late afternoon, dust clinging to his coat. He dismounted heavily, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. "Turner," he said, voice low but steady. "Folks are talking. They say you found something down there." "Something Holden don't want seen." Elias studied him carefully. "People have quick tongues." Jed's eyes narrowed. "That ain't an answer." Elias let the silence stretch before he spoke again. "I found proof Reed wasn't just some settler who vanished. He was tied to something bigger, Smuggling, blackmail, maybe worse. And Holden knew it. Jed's face tightened, anger flashing across his weathered features. Damn it, I knew the sheriff was hiding something. Man's been too quick to shut questions down. You need to be careful, Turner. If Holden feels cornered, he'll come at you harder than he already has. Before Elias could reply, Martha Kane appeared at the edge of the clearing, her shawl wrapped tightly against the cold. She approached with cautious steps, her expression troubled. I heard whispers in town, she said, her voice soft but urgent. People are saying you're stirring up things that should have been left alone. Some are afraid of Holden, but others are afraid of you. Elias frowned. Afraid of me? Martha nodded. They think you brought trouble with you, that by opening that cellar, you dragged the past back into the present. I know you didn't mean harm, but fear twists the truth until it's unrecognizable. Jed spat into the dirt, frustration sharp in his voice. Cowards. They'd rather bow to Holden's lies than face the truth staring them in the eye. Martha turned to Elias, her gaze steady. You need to decide what you'll do next. If you push too hard, the town may turn against you. And if you stay silent, Holden will keep his grip over everyone. Either way, it won't be easy. Elias looked from Martha to Jed, then back toward the cabin where the cellar lay hidden beneath the floor. He felt the weight of the ledger in his memory, the names written inside, the trades recorded, the evidence that tied the sheriff to Reed's outlaw dealings. His instinct screamed at him to act, to reveal the truth, but Martha's warning echoed just as strongly. Peace don't come free out here, Elias said finally, his voice heavy. It comes from choosing which fight to take on and which to walk away from. Martha's eyes softened. And this fight could cost you everything. I don't want to see you destroyed by it. Jed shook his head. Or it could free this town from Holden's grip once and for all. Elias clenched his fists at his sides, torn between the weight of responsibility and the desire for quiet survival. He had lived too long wandering, but perhaps settling meant more than just patching roofs and chopping wood. Perhaps it meant carrying burdens that others refused to shoulder. As dusk settled, the town's whispers grew louder, carried by the wind, and Elias knew he couldn't remain silent much longer. The truth he had unearthed was no longer just his secret. It was a storm waiting to break over Dawson's Crossing. The nights grew longer, and with them Elias Turner's thoughts circled tighter around the choice that weighed on him. He had spent his life following instinct, moving with the land, surviving on little more than grit and stubborn will. But this decision was different. It wasn't about hunger or cold. It was about truth, and truth was heavier than any winter snow. The ledger haunted him most. Each page bore names, dates, and dealings, some marked with numbers that made clear the stakes involved, trades of gold, shipments of contraband, and notes scrawled in Reed's hand that hinted at violence. Among the names, Elias had recognized some tied to Dawson's Crossing itself, a rancher here, a trader there, men who still walked the streets, men who shook hands as if their pasts were clean. He sat by the fire, turning the ledger's brittle pages slowly, as though each one might burn his fingers. The weight of it filled the cabin with an oppressive silence. His instincts screamed that hiding such truth was wrong, but another voice, practical, cautious, whispered that speaking it aloud might destroy him. Jed Collins arrived one afternoon, his eyes sharp with urgency. "I've seen the ledger, haven't you?" Elias didn't answer at once. Instead, he closed the book and set it on the table. "I've seen enough." Jed leaned forward, his voice low. "Then you know what Holden's been hiding. You know why he's so desperate to keep that cellar shut. If you bring this to light, Turner, you'll strip him of his badge." Elias studied him carefully. "And what then? You think the town will thank me? That folks will line up to shake my hand for exposing their neighbors?" Jed's jaw tightened. "Maybe not, but they'll have to face the truth, and I'll stand with you." The words carried weight, but Elias knew promises made in anger could wither under pressure. He gave a short nod, neither accepting nor rejecting the vow. That evening, Martha Kane visited. She stepped into the cabin quietly, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. Her gaze fell on the ledger before Elias could move it. Her eyes darkened. "So it's true," You found proof. Elias met her gaze, unflinching. I did. Martha stepped closer, lowering her voice. Elias, you don't understand what this could do. Those names, some of them belong to men with families, men who've lived decent lives since. If you drag it all into the open, you won't just expose them. You'll tear apart everything this town has managed to hold together. Elias felt the pull of her words, heavy and sharp. He wanted to argue, to say that silence was no better than complicity. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw the truth of her fear. She had already lost one man to violence. She did not want to see another swallowed by it. He turned away, staring at the flames in the hearth. What would you have me do, Martha? Burn the ledger? Pretend I never opened the door? Her voice trembled, though she held her composure. I'd have you think carefully about whether justice and ruin are worth the same price. Sometimes, letting the past stay buried is the only way to protect the living. Her words left Elias in silence long after she departed. He paced the cabin, the fire casting restless shadows on the walls. His mind warred between Jed's righteous anger and Martha's desperate caution. Finally, as the fire burned low, Elias placed the ledger back on the table. His decision crystallized, solid and immovable. I can't carry silence, he whispered to the empty cabin. Not anymore. The choice was made. Whatever the cost, Elias Turner would act. Elias Turner stood in the center of Dawson's Crossing as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-packed streets. The town, always quiet in the evening, now felt charged, heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. The truth he had unearthed lay in his hands like a torch, and he knew that by revealing it, he would set fire to everything around him. His boots crunched through the snow as he made his way toward the sheriff's office. There was no turning back. The ledger he had found, the gold, the names, all of it demanded to be known. The town could not live in ignorance any longer, not when so many had been complicit in hiding its darkness. Sheriff Holden had been silent for days, watching, waiting. Elias had no doubt that the sheriff knew what was coming. And as much as he feared what would happen next, Elias also knew that there was no peace to be found without this final reckoning. The door to the sheriff's office swung open with a creak. Inside, Holden sat at his desk, his coat hung over the back of his chair, the dim light from the oil lamp flickering in his eyes. He didn't look surprised to see Elias standing there. He had known this moment was inevitable. Elias didn't waste time. He placed the ledger on the desk between them, its edges worn from use, its pages yellowed with age. Holden's eyes flicked to it, but he didn't touch it. "You've made your choice," Holden said, his voice quiet, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "You don't know what you're doing, Turner. You're about to burn this town to the ground." Elias took a step forward, his voice steady. "No, Sheriff, I'm giving it a chance to rebuild, a chance to breathe without the lies smothering it. Reed's dealings, your dealings, can't stay hidden any longer." Holden stood slowly, his broad frame filling the room as he moved toward Elias. There was a tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. "You think exposing all of this will make things better? It will tear us apart. You're a fool if you think the truth will heal anything." Elias's eyes never left the sheriff's. "I've lived too long in silence, Holden, and I won't let this town continue to suffocate under the weight of its own secrets. People deserve the truth even if it costs them everything." Holden's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "You'll be the one paying that price, Turner. You think you're a hero for doing this? You're a damn fool." The sheriff's voice grew low, dangerous. "You're making a powerful enemy. You've seen what I'm capable of, and you've seen what happens when men like me are backed into a corner. I will destroy you if I have to." Elias took another step closer, his heart steady, his resolve unshaken. "You can try, Sheriff, but the truth always finds its way to the surface, and when it does, there's no hiding from it." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The tension crackled between them like an electrical storm, each waiting for the other to make a move. Holden's eyes burned with fury, but Elias stood unflinching. Finally, the sheriff broke the silence. "You've made your bed, Turner. Now, lie in it." Elias turned and walked toward the door, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him like the heavy snow outside. He knew that the town would never be the same, that the sheriff would never forgive him for what he had revealed, but he also knew that the truth could not be buried forever. As Elias stepped out into the fading light of the day, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. The storm had come and there was no turning back. Dawson's Crossing would be forced to face the truth, whether it was ready or not. The storm Elias Turner had unleashed did not pass quickly. Dawson's Crossing staggered under the weight of what he had revealed. Families whispered in corners, merchants cast wary looks, and the sheriff's name, once spoken with authority, became laced with contempt. Holden stripped his own badge from his chest and left town without a word, riding off into the hills with nothing but disgrace trailing behind him. Elias watched it all unfold with quiet resolve. He had not set out to be a crusader, yet the burden of truth had settled on his shoulders and he had carried it. The town would recover, though not without scars. But scars, Elias knew, were part of survival. They reminded a man of what he had endured. At his cabin, the cellar stood open and empty now. The chest had been removed, the gold hidden away. The ledger passed into the hands of those who would decide what came next. The once ominous trapdoor was now nothing more than wood and iron, stripped of its secrets. Elias often stared at it in the quiet hours of the night, not with fear, but with a strange calm. It was no longer a prison for silence. It was a reminder of what truth could cost. One afternoon, as the snow began to thaw and the first signs of spring edged across the land, Martha Kane walked up the path to his cabin. She carried no bread this time, only her steady presence. Elias greeted her at the door. His expression softened from the man who had once lived only for solitude. "You stayed," she said, her voice warm. Elias nodded. "I thought about leaving, thought about taking what's left of me back to the mountains, but I traded my horse for this place and I reckon it's time I see the trade through." Martha's eyes glimmered with quiet approval. "Then you're not just passing through anymore." He gave a faint smile, one that surprised even him. "No, not anymore." They sat together by the fire, speaking of simple things. The thaw, the school children, the work that awaited when spring fully arrived. Yet beneath their words lay something unspoken, the possibility of companionship, of building a life that was no longer carved from loneliness. Later, as dusk settled over the valley, Elias stepped outside. The horizon glowed with the last light of day, the mountains standing tall and unyielding as they always had. For years, those peaks had been his only companions. Now, he felt something shift within him. He was no longer a man bound to the wilderness alone. He had chosen to belong, to stand among others, to face their struggles as his own. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sense of pine and thawing earth. Elias breathed deeply, letting the air fill his lungs. He thought of the cellar, of the sheriff's fear, of the ledger that had nearly torn the town apart. And he thought of the decision he had made, to open the door, to face what lay beneath, to refuse silence. It had nearly broken him, but it had also remade him. He turned back toward the cabin, its chimney spilling smoke into the cool evening air. The place was no longer just shelter. It was home. Before we close this story, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the journeys yet to come. Elias Turner had traded his horse for a cabin, but in truth he had traded something greater, wandering for belonging, silence for truth, solitude for the chance of connection. The cellar that once haunted him was now only wood, the past locked away where it belonged. And as the stars pricked through the darkening sky, Elias knew his story was not an ending but a beginning. So if you've walked this far with him, don't stop now. Click on the next video waiting on your screen and continue the journey.